My name is David Wilkinson. I'm the principal of this college. It gives me great joy to welcome you all here this evening. In our first Ruth Etchells lecture, we are surrounded by Ruth's legacy in the physical building in which we meet this evening, the Leach Hall, which was completed during her principalship of this college. We've also got on display her legacy in stained glass. At the back of the room, you'll see some new works from Ruth, which we've been able to complete and frame to complement the one that is in the glass here in the Leach Hall at the back of the room. So at the end of the lecture, as well as drinks and canapes, please have a look at the stained glass. We are broadcasting this live this evening, so there will be folk joining us on the web. I should say a welcome to those joining us on the web as well, and then the lecture will be recorded and then put up on the web if you want to go back and listen to it again or get other people to watch it and share in it. But most of all, we give thanks for the intellectual and spiritual legacy of Ruth. And that's what we wanted to mark at the beginning of a project which she kindly endowed to explore the relationship between theology and literature. I'm going to introduce Dr. Margaret Masson to chair this evening and introduce our first lecturer. Margaret, a friend and colleague of Ruth's. It seemed appropriate for Margaret to chair this. And so Margaret, over to you.
It's one of Ruth's supervisees, a student of Ruth, and in fact, it was thanks to Ruth that I came to Durham. And it's a real honour to be able to welcome you to this inaugural lecture. We're honouring a woman who was very important to this place, to this college. She was principal for many years. Every time I come into this hall, I think of Ruth. It was very much her legacy. And it exemplified so much of what she believed St John's was about, crossroads of all kinds of things, ordinands, undergraduates and postgraduates, theology, all the other disciplines, and all of that kind of thing. So she was a much loved person in this place. She was also much respected and much loved as a scholar and a teacher. And beyond that, I know that she's very important to quite a number of us here, as a very dear friend, as a wise counsellor, as a deeply spiritual person, as a remarkable human being. One of the things that Ruth was very keen to do was to leave a legacy to this college, something that would help continue us to engage with probably one of her chief loves, theology and literature, the conversation between the two disciplines. And so this is the first event really we're having to try to honour and interpret that. So we thought we'd institute an annual lecture, and this is the first of the lectures, and it didn't actually take very long at all to decide who we wanted to be our first lecturer. We knew that we wanted someone to be a distinguished scholar. We wanted someone who cared about the interdisciplinary study of literature and theology, and we wanted someone who knew Ruth. And I think it's possible there's only about one person who ticks all those boxes. And so we were hugely delighted when Dick Watson, Professor J.R. Watson, said yes. He's a very distinguished scholar in the fields of Romanticism and Victorian literature. He's probably the leading authority in the world on hymnody. And again, it's wonderful that that's a discipline, that's a whole area where poetry and faith intersect possibly at their deepest. And just as a sideline, Dick was one of the people who was most instrumental in founding the undergraduate course in the English department on biblical and classical background to literature. And I think we started that course precisely 17 years ago. And I know precisely because I was pregnant at the time of writing some of the lectures for that first year of the course, which still runs today in Durham. But just as important, I think, for our purposes and for this first lecture, Dick was a colleague of Ruth's, a friend of Ruth's, someone who, like many of us here, love Ruth Etchells and is so well placed, I think, to interpret what we wanted tonight to be about. So thank you very, very much for coming, Dick, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Oh, it's got a green light. Thank you. I'm hoping to... I've got this thing on, but I hope I'll be able to manage without it, and you will be able to hear me pretty well anyway. It is a great honour to have been asked to give this Ruth Etchells lecture. It's also a very great pleasure to record a friendship with a much-loved colleague in the English department, and I want to say more about that later. I propose to say something about Ruth's life and work in due course, but before doing so, I can think of no better way to celebrate that life and work than to introduce a woman whose life had some similarities with Ruth's, and some very significant differences, and whose writings show a spirit with which Ruth would, I believe, have been in sympathy. Dora Greenwell was born just 110 years before Ruth, and the context of her life was very different, but I hope to point to places in her life and work and her writing that make her a kindred spirit to the woman we knew and loved and whom we commemorate today. I also like to think that Ruth would have approved of a lecture that was not just about herself, but about another woman who deserves to be remembered, especially in Durham. That woman was called by her best biographer, Constance Maynard, a prophet. Maynard's biography of her is subtitled A Prophet of Her Time in the Battleground of Our Faith. And it's that prophetic voice that I shall argue links the two women across a century of change. Dorothy, or Dora Greenwell, was born in Manchester on the 6th of December 1821 into a well-known local family. Many of you will remember the name of Greenwell from times past. Her father owned a substantial house called Greenwell Ford, with grounds that ran down to the River Brownie, and he was a notable figure, a Deputy Lieutenant of the County of Durham, a magistrate, a friend of the great antiquarian Robert Surtees, and a benign figure to the tenants of his estate. But he was careless with money and became involved in a lawsuit, and in 1848 the house had to be sold. Dora and her parents went to live with her elder brother William, who was acting as rector of Ovington in the Tyne Valley. They lived there for 2 years, during which time Dora published a volume of poems and made an important new friendship with Josephine Gray, who lived at nearby Dilston, and as you will know, Josephine Gray became Josephine Butler. In 1859, Dora dedicated her book, The Patience of Hope, to Josephine Butler with the inscription Te sine ni altium mens inchoat. Without thee my mind attempts nothing high. And she wrote of Josephine Butler, I should have felt her far too removed, lifted, as it were, out of my reach, were it not for the tender, humble love which bridged over the space between. After 2 years at Ovington, Dora and her parents went to live with another clerical brother, Alan, at Goldbourne near Warrington in Lancashire. It was there that her father died, and when her brother fell ill and had to leave the parish, Dora and her mother moved to Durham. It was a return to the county of her birth, and her brother William had just been appointed a minor canon of the cathedral. The year was 1854. Dora was 32 years old. They took a house in the Bailey and on Sundays worshipped in the little church of St Mary the Less. They lived there for 18 years until her mother's death in 1871 when Dora was 50. It was in these Durham years that Dora did much of her best writing and continued her study of classical and modern European languages. She also became involved in work for the poor in the Durham workhouse, and she did prison visiting. As a member of a genteel class, however impoverished, she and her mother had a certain position to keep up, and they had an establishment that included servants. Servants, of course, were not expensive in those days, and there were demands upon her from Durham society. There are signs that the prim social occasions in Durham may have been irritating. People, one observer reported, people were rather afraid of Miss Greenwell because she said such unexpected things. Equally irritating, indeed much more than irritating, was her mother's possessive nature and her failure to encourage. According to Constance Maynard, she exerted a sort of passive resistance to any new acquaintances made by her daughter. Her mother never thoroughly approved of her life, her occupations, or her friends. If she went out to see people during the evening, her mother would send a servant to fetch her home, presumably just as she was beginning to enjoy herself. Meanwhile, her brother William, who had been educated at University College Durham, had the annoying habit, or the effrontery as it now seems, to describe her as having had a very flimsy education for a sharp mind like hers. He thought that, and I quote, philosophy, biography, medieval legends, political economy, nothing came amiss, and she read widely, but when she tried to express herself, everything had the same defect. All was so undisciplined, so unfinished. Since higher education was out of the reach of women at the time, his comments seem, with hindsight, to be not only patronising, but infuriating. It was in this situation that Dora Greenwell found herself for 18 years in Durham. It caused her much heartache and what looks like depression. The poet Jean Ingelow, who visited her in Durham, described her as living in a shaded world. And Dora told Constance Maynard that, quote, only those who had experienced the utter helplessness of life reduced to its lowest point, to an exhaustion that was all but extinction, could tell what it meant. She is believed to have had long periods of ill health, and it is possible that these may have been psychosomatic, a response to her situation. Her writing at the time must have been as it was for the Bronte sisters a few years earlier, a passionate expression of her inner self. It is seen very clearly in an essay she wrote, which was published at Edinburgh in the North British Review in February 1862. She seems to have had an opening to the review through William Knight, a professor at the University of St Andrews, and it's not known how she came to know him, but he encouraged her writing and helped to get it published. The essay that I mentioned was called Our Single Women. It began with a kind of forced cheeriness that is clearly ironic. If in a multitude of counsellors there is safety, how blessed must be the security of single women. Everyone who has a little spare wisdom at command seems just now inclined to lay it out for their benefit. And she went on, single women must surely feel a little alarmed at discovering how much is expected from them, at finding themselves looked upon as a hitherto unclaimed dividend, which society is at length bent upon realising. The context of this is that something remarkable was happening in the national consciousness. Women's voices were beginning to be heard, even in an oblique form in the novel and in poetry. If the Bronte sisters published under assumed names and Mary Ann Evans called herself George Eliot, the secret was soon known. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who had died in the previous year, had not been afraid to enter Italian politics with Casa Guidi windows. And in the world of public affairs, the names of Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole had astonished the world during the Crimean War. Imagine reading about these things in the Bailey at Durham, with your mother as constant responsibility and your brother as constant critique. And she wrote the first piece on your handout, the conditions of life grow continually less and less severe, yet more and more complicated. The springs of thought, of love, lie deeper. Conscience grows more exacting. Responsibilities widen. Women's whole being is more sensitive. It may now perhaps be harder for her than it has ever yet been to make her wishes and her fate agree, to bring her external existence into harmony with her inner life. It's the sad mismatch between her wishes and her fate that seems so tragic. But it is at this point that we hear the prophetic voice for the first time. She had read Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford and thought, wrongly I think, that it described a society of contented old maids. In the face of this, she looks forward to a new freedom and a new world of activity. This is the second extract. We expect yet to see a time when woman will dare to be that for which God made her, and that she will at last be allowed to traffic freely for his honour and her own profit with the portion of goods that has been allotted to her. Woman's heart and mind have grown, and her world must expand with them. Her life may be less safe, less comfortable than in times when she could contentedly drift into the shelter of some little Cranford and there remain at anchor for the rest of her life. Instead, of course, Dora Greenwell's life was a life, however rich in material comforts, fenced in, as she said, with 1,000 unmeaning restrictions. She saw women, and I quote, far more weary of inaction than they will ever be of labour, waiting for the work which is waiting for them. There were two fields of labour that she went on to describe. One had a local interest, as she described an initiative at Middlesbrough, a town where, as she says, there was one farm 35 years ago, and now there are more than 19,000 inhabitants. And in 1859, a woman who had spent a year in Germany training opened a cottage hospital. The hospital grew and had to be moved to the outskirts. Then a convalescent home was opened, and then an orphanage. It was a work that for Dora Greenwell triumphantly proved that given the freedom of action and opportunity, women could play a full part in society. The other field of labour, however, is even more startlingly prophetic in 1862. That was the church. Dora Greenwell quotes from Isaiah 54 verse 2 in the next section in your handout. It is time, surely, for the Church of Christ to awake to that prophetic exhortation, enlarge the place of thy tent, spare not, lengthen thy cords and strengthen thy stakes. It is time then that God's other kingdom, that one which shall never be removed, should also extend its borders, should ascertain its wealth, should apply and multiply all its resources. Has the Christian church in our country yet done this? Are we not justified in calling upon her to imitate the divine economy of her great master, to see that among so many holy and heaven-sent impulses nothing be lost in mortifying failure or misdirected effort? Is it not time for her to show herself generous, or rather just, towards her daughters, to give them a recognised place, a defined work in the ministry? Apart from the church's failure to use what might be called the divine economy of talent, male and female, it's not clear exactly what she had in mind. It seems to have been that women could do things that men could not. Beneath, she goes on, beneath our hotbed civilization, not very far beneath it, lies a stratum of ignorance and grossness, needing a broader wedge to penetrate it than our clergy are able to supply without the aid of some missionary agency as associated female labour might supply. The poor man's life is the greatest social problem of our day. Associated female labour is, of course, far from any idea of the ordination of women to the priesthood, which would have been unthinkable in 1862 and impossible too, because no woman had access to higher education. But fast forward 130 years to 1992, and I can hear Ruth's voice, as I caught it on television, addressing the General Synod in November of that year in the final debate of the long drawn-out process by which women were ordained to the priesthood. The circumstances were different, but the spirit which inspired Dora Greenwell spoke again in Ruth Etchells. There are other essays in that 1866 volume of essays in which our single women was reprinted. There are other essays in that volume that might be quoted, but in the time that I have, I shall concentrate on one called Prayer. I do so for the obvious reason that Ruth published books of prayers, Just As I Am in 1994, Safer Than a Known Way in 2006, and A Rainbow-Coloured Cross in 2007. She begins, this is Ruth beginning, rightly understood, everything that exists is occasion for prayer, calling us to a towardness, a turning to God our Father, who is creator of sparrow and leviathan. A little further on in the introduction she writes, this is the fourth extract on your first sheet, but for this to be so, we must play our right part. For humanity's unique gift is, in George Herbert's marvellous phrase, to be secretary of his praise. And that is what our daily praying is about, making holy to the Lord what is around us, as well as that part of the world consciousness that we carry within us. We trace for God the life we are part of and offer it to him, discovering, in so doing, the texture of prayer. The prayers that follow are a remarkable record of a spiritual life lived in the midst of a world that most of us experience. One that is capable of moments of joy and peace, but one that can be distracting, unpeaceful, and often very annoying. Lord, writes Ruth on one occasion, I have been struggling all day with the intransigence of things. It's the fifth of those extracts there. Nothing has gone smoothly, and the day has seemed full of minor domestic difficulties and personal irritabilities, and I felt like a cat with its fur rubbed the wrong way. Keep me trusting, Lord, in the grace I have glimpsed and known as the ultimate truth about life, trusting in that essential rightness behind the chaos and its shaping by you, the one and no other, who is the answer to all sums. The prayers that follow are a remarkable record of this life that she lived. And I think she would have seen the point of what Dora Greenwell was saying in her essay 100 years before, 120 years before, where she is exploring the relationship between humanity and God. Human beings have their own wills, for God has given them freedom, and they can use those wills to respond to his invitation to address him. This is the last extract on the first page. Prayer is the voice of one who was created free, although he was born in chains. It is at once self-assertion and self-surrender. It claims a will even in surrendering it, when it says, not my will, but thy will be done. It is perhaps the greatest of all witnesses to the spiritual nature of man, as nothing so dignifies human nature or so enhances the sense of its fixed relation with the divine as does prayer, the true conception of which involves the idea of a certain power possessed by humanity over God. Prayer is God's acknowledgement, his endorsement of his own gift of freedom to man. It is his royal invitation. He is inured to delay, resigned to denial through Christ, which strengtheneth him. He can do all things except cease to pray. To her, that prayer is her life and work. She has a splendid side swipe at Thomas Carlyle and his Gospel of Work, as it is found in Past and Present, which was very influential, of course, in her day. Carlyle commends the medieval monks for saying, laborare est orare, work is prayer. And she responds, and it's the second piece on your second sheet, we have had enough in our day of the shallow evangel of labour, man's gospel preached to man. We have been told till we are weary of hearing it, that he who works prays. But let us lift up our hearts high enough to meet a fuller, deeper, richer truth. Let us learn that he who prays works, even with his God, is humble enough, is bold enough to help him who upholds all things with the word of his power. Her argument is that Carlyle's is man's gospel preached to man, whereas in her view, prayer is spirit acting upon spirit. It is the will of man brought to bear upon the will of God. It was her belief, therefore, that prayer could change things in the world, a belief that we all share when we pray for peace. Can prayer make things that are not to be as though they were? Are events, in short, brought about through prayer that would not otherwise take place? Yes, 1,000 times yes, says Dora Greenwell. The enthusiasm of that last phrase is characteristic of Dora's ardent spirit, which is found at its most active in her poetry. She published 3 books in her lifetime: the early poems of 1848, Carmina Crucis in 1869, or Crucis, and Songs of Salvation in 1873. Most of her books have on the page the emblem, which you have there, of a hand holding a cross with the words et teneo et teneor, I both hold and am held. I shall mention only one poem from the last book, the Songs of Salvation of 1873. I should mention it because it is one that I have been familiar with all my life, for it's in the Methodist hymn book with which I was brought up. It begins, significantly I think, I am not skilled to understand, which seems to me to be the self-assessment of a woman who had been consistently told by her clerical brother that she was no good as a writer. I find it very sad that a woman whose intellectual energy went into the learning of several languages, reading of philosophy, political economy, and history, but who had no opportunity to study with others or to study methodically, should have had to write, as she does later in that hymn of the unskilled person. She writes later in that hymn, and was there then no other way, she's talking about dying on the cross, no other way for God to take, I cannot say. She was consciously stepping back from theology into the modest obscurity of a woman's proper place in the 1860s. Something of her unhappiness is found in a poem from Carmina Crucis that looks back at the hope and joy of childhood. It's called The Playfellow, and it describes a game of hide-and-seek that went wrong. Far away and long ago and far away, love, hope, joy and I together played. Ah, many a day. Till one day, within the dell, hope and joy, together hiding, hid so long and hid so well, we found them not. We knew that we had seen the last of hope and joy, no more together play we there in summer weather. Another poem, A Life Requiem, uses the German word herb, bitter, Bitter is the innermost core of life. Herb ist des Lebens innerster Kern. It ends, the day is past. The night draws on. O night, be thou more warm, more kind than was the light. Although Greenwell puts this into the mouth of a singer, the terrible insistent imagery of crushing cold and darkness is unrelenting, with that final plea that is almost more dreadful. Death would be preferable to this existence. The last poem in Carmina Crucis is the one by which she is remembered. It sets this despair into the context of the Incarnation. It is called Veni, Veni, Emmanuel. It's in three parts. The first describes he who comes from Edom and Bozrah, from Isaiah chapter 63, and the second describes the one who unseals the book, from Revelation 5. Part 3 begins with the Emmanuel theme, and art thou come with us to dwell. It is a moment in which God becomes, in the last line of verse 1, not on your handout, God present with his world restored. It's a wonderful take on the Incarnation. The coming of Christ will lead to a new world in which all that has been shut up in a spiritual winter will begin to bloom and flourish. And initially the images are those of flowers, as in verses 3 and 4, which are the first two on your handout. The heart is glad for thee, it knows none now shall bid it err or mourn, and o'er its desert breaks the rose in triumph, o'er the grieving thorn. Thou bringest all again, with thee is light, is space, is breadth and room for each thing, fair, beloved and free, to have its hour of life and bloom. The soul now has space to grow and fulfill its purpose, unhindered by the restraints and restrictions that have held it in prison. The soul can now trust its instincts, reveal its deepest feelings, each heart's deep instinct unconfessed, each lowly wish, each daring claim, all that life has long repressed unfolds, undreading blight or blame. 50 years before Freud, we have the concept of repression and the damage that it can do to the human psyche. Unfolds suggests the soul as a flower opening to the sunshine, which is the theme of the next verses. Thy reign eternal will not cease. Thy years are sure and glad and slow. Within thy mighty world of peace, the humblest flower hath leave to blow, and spread its leaves to meet the sun, and drink within its soul the dew. The child's sweet laugh like light may run through life's long day and still be true. And finally, the suppressed sexuality of the poem emerges in the last verses, in which a passionate love begins and ends the verse, complemented by the friendship of the second line. The maid's fond sigh, the lover's kiss, the firm, warm clasp of constant friend, and naught shall fail and naught shall miss its blissful aim, its blissful end. The world is glad for thee, the heart is glad for thee, and all is well and fixed and sure, because thou art, whose name is called Emmanuel. This is what the coming of Christ could mean for a woman writer in the 19th century. Maynard describes the poem as ending in triumph. Every shadow flees away before this triumphant sunrise. it's possible to suggest that there may be an echo of another woman writer, Julian of Norwich, all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. But Maynard was writing before the perception of a subtext, and there is an obvious and very sad subtext to this poem. There is little more to say about Dora Greenwell. When her mother died in 1874, she went to live in London. It did not work out. As Maynard put it, freedom was pleasant in her eyes, but it came too late. She had very little power of judgment in the affairs of practical life. She, who had lived under perpetual restraint, was now free to create disaster after disaster, and she did so. Unable to manage servants, she employed a Mrs. Lawrence, who, according to Maynard, began in secret to drink brandy and encouraged her mistress to lessen her stomach pains by taking opium. Dora became addicted and after a near fatal accident went to live with her brother Alan in Bristol, where she died in 1882, aged 60. In contrast, what is astonishing about Ruth Etchells is the life that she led and the influence that she had. One of the reasons for dwelling for so long on Dora Greenwell is that Ruth's life can be seen, I think, more clearly in comparison. There are, in the first place, striking similarities, including their names, Dorothy or Dora and Dorothea Ruth. In addition to the remarkable parallel of their Durham lives, both were single women, both looked after their mothers. Ruth has a revealing moment in Safer Than a Known Way, in which she writes of, quote, the needs of my elderly and frail. Both set a high value on friendship. Both were intelligent and avid readers who were fascinated, as Margaret has suggested, by the relationship between literature and religion. But of course there are huge differences. Ruth's mother, Ada Etchells, was a great encourager of her daughter, for a start. And 100 years of progress, however intermittent and slow and reluctant, allowed Ruth to fulfill ambitions that were denied to many of her predecessors. She was properly educated and went on to be a teacher, first in a school and then in a college of education, before coming to Durham in 1968. Her career here was a most distinguished one, first at Trevelyan College and then at this college, which included, of course, Cranmer Hall. One cannot help wondering what Canon Greenwell would have made of Ruth as the first woman to become the head of a Church of England theological college. She held that office triumphantly with great skill and flair and a palpable sense of purpose and fairness. Almost as important was the atmosphere of the senior common room, where she presided over the best kind of Christian fellowship, never pious or unctuous, but always fresh and lively. There was a sprinkling of Durham people, such as Bill and Paddy Surtees, young scholars, such as Esther Hildebrandt, and, of course, her colleagues. I was privileged to be a member of it, and I've never forgotten the warmth of those evenings. I have never forgotten either the warmth of her first greeting to me in the English department of Elvid Riverside. She came across the room with her hand outstretched, saying, "Welcome to Durham," in such a way that I was instantly captivated. Her time in that department had not been an easy one. During the 1970s, before the arrival of Tom Craik in 1977, it had been notorious as a place of faction and disagreement, and Ruth was caught up in it once physically. Among the many legends of strife and discord that emerged from the department was one that I had trouble in believing. That a member of staff was so enraged that he stormed out of the room, in the process knocking Ruth off her chair onto the floor. I found this so awful and so difficult to believe that I once asked Ruth in public if this was true, and she nodded her head gravely. And I heard an account of it later from a witness, my friend and colleague, Anthea Morrison. I mention it here because it would be quite wrong to think that because she was born a century after Dora Greenwell, Ruth somehow walked through the sunny uplands of female emancipation, shedding blessings right and left like Botticelli's Primavera. What she inherited was a position in the world that was often frustrating and could be academically harsh. I remember that in about 1980, Ruth, with Stephen Sykes and myself, tried to introduce a new joint degree in English and theology. The debate in the Board of Studies was, like human life described by Hobbes, nasty, brutish and short. I would recall one quotation above when Greenwell said that women needed a wider sphere of activity. Greenwell said, you remember, her life may be less safe, less comfortable. When she said that, I guess she would have thought prophetically that a woman would have to be a part of the rough and tumble of the world of affairs. I'm sure she had no idea that the less comfortable estate would actually involve a woman being sent sprawling onto the floor. Ruth was a much-loved colleague, always constructive and reliable in her counsel in my time at the Board of Studies, which by then had become much more tranquil than that which had gone before. She was also an inspiring teacher. Her particular contribution to the department's curriculum was her course on modern drama. We should remember that in the 1970s and 1980s, this was cutting-edge stuff. In the years of John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, Harold Pinter, Edward Bond, of the angry young men and the theatre of the absurd. It was disturbing, angry, sometimes weird material. The students loved it. Many of us older ones relied on a book called Anger and After to guide us through, and I sometimes used to wonder at Ruth's choice. I often wished I could eavesdrop on her lectures, but I didn't like to seem to be snooping, and I never heard her on that topic. All I knew was that after those lectures, undergraduates would come to tutorials with a special excitement, a light in their eyes that I greatly admired. It became a course that some of us who were not temperamentally inclined towards either angry or absurd drama came to know and appreciate through Ruth's teaching and the students' reaction to it. I have sometimes wondered since if her enthusiasm for this kind of literature was part of her understanding of the world and its wickedness, that it was, in a way, a sympathy with protest. Her anger is evident in Safer Than a Known Way and in A Rainbow-Coloured Cross. They don't throw Christians to the lions in any coliseum round here, not physically, she writes at one point, but they do the equivalent, don't they? And the 8th day evening in A Rainbow-Coloured Cross begins, "Oh my Lord, I cannot rest tonight because of my anger." One of the features of Ruth's life that we must be grateful for is that she lived at a time when it was permitted to speak of these things and not leave them hidden and repressed. Her righteous and controlled anger would make a study in itself, I think, but just let me note that it was brave and bold of her to include it in a book or in books of prayer. It was part of the way in which those books are as authentic in their way as Greenwell's passionate cries and longings are, and at times strikingly similar. She writes in the 19th day morning prayer in Sefer, and I think it's the top quotation in your third page, Lord of the morning, I do not want to rise and face this day. I am weary of the endless round of tasks, of its tedium, of the lack of encouragement or appreciation, the weariness of grinding routine, the draining impact of constant petty criticism. And I feel so condemned, Lord, by the lack of space for myself and my dreams. I feel a prisoner in my own life. Somewhere there must be freedom and light and gaiety and delight and stimulus and variety and encouragement and a shared larger vision. Remember what Greenwell was writing 100 years before. But in my present way of life, Lord, I feel suffocated, trapped in a small dark room where the air is all but consumed. In some places, of course, that anger is not about her own personal frustration, but about the church and the world, and it is at those points that she inherits the prophetic voice. I have no doubt that she was deeply influenced by the Old Testament prophets, and that the voices of Ezekiel and Hosea and Amos are found again in her work. It is not just that she was prophetic in that the joint degree that she hoped for came to pass 30 years later, and that the Church of England began to allow women to play their full part. She was prophetic as the Old Testament prophets were in her perception of injustice and unfairness in the world that she both loved and lamented over. Her vision of that world depended to a considerable extent on the way in which she was stirred by the literature that she read. She inherited from Coleridge the sense of the importance of the imagination, and she quotes him in her book, A Model of Making, subtitled Literary Criticism and Theology, published in 1983 and dedicated to her mother, who had died 2 years earlier. It's a book that addresses questions of literary theory, notably the post-structuralist reader response ideas that were in vogue at the time. It points out that the response to literature depends on the point of view of the reader and attempts to establish a theological take on the act of reading, while not acknowledging that in the end, literature resists final explication. It's a book that refuses to argue for what might be called a doctrinally based Christian criticism. Indeed, it's sharply aware of the abuses of such a practice. Rather, it points out that reader response depends on the position which is taken up by the reader, which could be, say, Marxist, but may well be a Christian one, noting that, quote, the very nature of the theology which provides the grounding of critical reading is that it is both, underlined, both stable and open to fresh disclosures, both conserving and subversive. I'm not sure that this is entirely successful, if only because it seems to me to be what literary criticism does instinctively. There's a continuous interplay between the attempt to establish a commonly understood meaning and an urge to undermine that meaning by finding alternatives. That is, always assuming that it is still interested in meaning at all, which is not always the case. And the book as a whole is disfigured by misprints, which makes me think that Ruth was never given a chance to see the proofs. But his position about point of view is clear-sighted and helpful, and its central reliance on Coleridge is clear and important. Ruth quotes him on the primary imagination, that it is the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. She does not quote, though I know that she would have believed it, Coleridge on the function of words, where he rejects the idea of words as a clothing for thought. The truths and the symbols that represent them move in conjunction and form the living chariot that bears up for us the throne of the divine humanity. Coleridge was using the vision of the chariots in Ezekiel chapter 1. For him, as for other poets, such as Blake, Ezekiel was thought of as the most poetic of Old Testament prophets. It points, I think, to the way in which Ruth uses poetry, her own and that of others, to shape her vision and her prayer life. The poems are not just added on to the prayers, they are an integral part of the process by which she thinks her way into situations and occasions. The poems interact with the prose, the vision with the thought. They are beautiful in themselves as literature, but then they take on a new life as springboards to an inquiring and unrelentingly honest devotion. They can be ecstatic and thankful, as in Thomas Traherne, how like an angel came I down, or they can be tough, as Ruth's own Blitzkrieg Britain 1940, written for a British Legion Festival of Remembrance in 2005, in which the adult remembers the time as a child when he was there in London when it was being bombed. And Anne Harrison tells me that this was based on Ruth's own experience. Ruth's own poems emerge from her own conflicts and preoccupations in a particularly obvious way. Some are characteristic of her courageous and almost steely determination. On the 19th day, which I've quoted from, when she says she wasn't wanting to rise and face the day, she follows that with the passage on your sheet from Philippians. You gave up the infinite space of eternity, the shining serenity of heaven, surrendered your power, honour, and rightful glory to the crushing finitude of our human life. In the poem Christmas Present, written for Christmas Eve, which begins midnight, the stillness of waiting, and sets that moment against all the fuss and bother of the frantic rush of hours beforehand. But the poem that I want to finish with is an enchanting and intriguing one, the Carol of Mary and the Apple, which I think occupies the same place as Veni, Veni, Emmanuel does in Dora Greenwell's. It is based, Ruth tells us, on a short story by Ulrich Simon. The idea is that the serpent wept in the Garden of Eden, and in his repentance we see the way towards our salvation. It's there at the bottom of your third page. Suppose the serpent could have been made to weep, and thus the awful power of evil broken, even in the garden. It is another way of telling the story of our salvation. It is Mary, traditionally the second Eve, who talks to the serpent. She commands him to eat, to find out about good and evil. Know in your blood. It's the penultimate verse of the know in your blood sourness of evil, sweetness of good. When the serpent bites the apple, the seeds fall out, begin a new life, while the serpent bowed his head. Last verse. I knew not before how to weep, he said. What follows is the loss of innocence, Abel dead, but also joy in grief, healing and forgiveness, the melting of snow. The serpent ends up in paradise with the other beasts in an echo of the holy mountain from Isaiah chapter 11. And throughout there is that carol-like refrain, "Oh, happy apple in paradise bright, when Eden was holy on Christmas night." In the same way that Dora Greenwell envisaged a new world of blossoming flowers, freedom and light, Ruth Etchells saw in this carol a new world, one that did not ignore the realities of evil, but transformed them with a redeeming love that embraced even the serpent. She loved Christmas not only for its Dickensian kindness and good fellowship, but also for its hope. It was a time when the hope of the world was born, and it was a supremely appropriate decision of the compilers of her funeral and Thanksgiving service in August to include Jesus Christ, the apple tree, her mother's favourite carol. Subconsciously, that carol may have been in Ruth's mind when she was writing the carol of Mary and the apple, although her inspiration carried the myth of the Garden of Eden into a new territory of the mind in which the evils of the world are confronted as they are in her prayers, and evil is turned to good, as Milton saw it in Paradise Lost. As a woman in the 20th and 21st centuries, Ruth had the opportunity to lead a full and active and influential life. She was a member of the General Synod, the Doctrine Commission of the Church of England, and the Crown Appointments Commission, on which she exercised an influence over the appointment of bishops and archbishops. It was a remarkably fruitful life, a colourful life. I like to think of the difference between Ruth and Dora Greenwell as being one of colour as opposed to monochrome. It would give her pleasure, I think, to be remembered not only for her academic and administrative work, but also as a craftswoman practising the art of stained glass. It was a craft that she took up in later life and did well. It was a new skill for her, one that allowed her to express something of the belief that was central to her life. That belief acknowledged the problems of the world and the problems of the self. And this was common to both of the women that we have been studying. The difference between them was that the first found no way out and ended unhappily. The second found a way out into a busy and productive life, and then into what she called, in one of her last writings, the wonder of life beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely riveting, magisterial, fascinating. And I think you just covered such a sort of wide range and yet stayed with these two remarkable women of Durham. So it's been fascinating to hear about Dora Greenwell, about whom I knew so very little, and to also understand Ruth through seeing through that prism or that sort of comparison. And I still see two women as well, and helping us sort of reflect, as you did throughout, and particularly at the end, on how much changed really in 160 or so years, a century and a half. Both women who had to do, and did brilliantly, I suppose, to do with what they'd been given, and also what they hadn't been given, and how that expressed itself in their prayer, in their poetry, in their lives. So we couldn't have asked for a better inaugural Ruth Etchells lecture, so thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Would have loved us to enjoy food and wine, so we have laid on some wine and some refreshments for you, so please, it's now a chance to stay behind and to have a glass of wine, have something to eat, to chat amongst ourselves, to chat with Dick, and just to carry on enjoying the evening for a while longer.